We're very pleased to have Professor Layashi with us today. He is a native of Algeria, which, as many of you know, has had major challenges with attempts to democratize at various times in its less than 50 years of independence. Professor Layashi took his bachelor's degree in Algiers at the Institut des Études Politiques, and then came to the United States to New York University, where he took a master's degree and PhD in international relations. From working on international relations, he has moved into comparative politics, which is so fascinating that he hasn't managed to leave this yet. He teaches he's an associate professor at St. John's University in New York, and works with me on the board of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies, Maghreb being North Africa. We've worked together as administrators, and I'd never heard him speak, but when we were looking for someone to speak, I was talking to a close friend of mine who directs the Middle East Center down in Arizona, and she said, we had a wonderful, wonderful speaker. Said you may be able to catch part of the address he gave on the radio. Did any of you, do you know about a radio station that runs through the internet called Democracy Now? It's Radio Pacifica. This is a very, very interesting institution which works at publicizing diverse points of view. And the person she was talking about was Ezzedine Layashi. I know him. We'll invite him. We'll bring him in. So he's been here with us. Probably the biggest effect on him in the last day, since 24 hours that he's been in Utah, has been the Iraq panel. He's going to go back to New York and tell his students they need to open up their minds that in Utah, 95% of the population is against the war in Iraq. So I don't know if we've just introduced him to the right group of people, or if we all in the state believe like this. That's what I'm telling him anyway. It's a very liberal state, and we are Republican, but we are very open. Professor Layashi works in comparative politics in North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and has published 3 books on those subjects as well as numerous articles. We're very happy to have him come here today to speak about questions of democratization in the Middle East. Professor Layashi.
Thank you. It's a really great honor, and I'm absolutely moved by the welcome, by the warmth of the welcome that I have received so far here. And I'm also learning a great deal about different way of running programs, and learning a lot about also quality of students here. And I have had a chance to interact with many of them within the last 24 hours. So I'm going to be talking about the issue of democracy and the Middle East. As you could tell, I did not say democracy in the Middle East, but and the Middle East, because it is an issue that many people have been writing about here and there, and in most writings, of course, there is a direct and total dismissal of any democratic experience in the Middle East as it appears today, or within the last, at least, let's say, since the end of the colonial era. So I'm going to be speaking about that and sharing with you some thoughts on the subject. Let me just start with the just a few facts. Last week there were elections in Bahrain, a pretty conservative kingdom in the Gulf, and they were the first parliamentary elections since Parliament was dissolved and the Constitution was suspended in 1975. By the king. A month earlier, on September 27th, Morocco held its first parliamentary election under the new king, Mohammed VI. And in between, Algeria held municipal elections, also which ran fairly decently, and before that, parliamentary elections in May. What is worth noting about these elections is that they were pluralist, relatively fair, and the results largely uncontested. This is a new trend, I would say, in the Middle East and North Africa, which started a few years ago, but which has been advancing, of course, at a very slow pace. These multi-party, fair, and uncontested elections constitute more what is termed electoral democracy, which is the minimum possible, than democracy itself. However, they do constitute a far cry from the situation that had prevailed just 10 years ago in most countries of the Middle East and North Africa, where pluralism was either illegal or meaningless. Parliaments were either suspended or simply serving as rubber stamps. And political dissent at the same time was punished by jailing or killing. And many opposition leaders had to leave the country if they managed to stay alive. It cannot be said that this situation has changed for all the countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. I'll be referring to them as MENA, for fast, to be fast, MENA, Middle East and North Africa region. But it has changed for many. These elections and other recent changes are not likely to affect the nature of the political regimes in place at any time soon, or alter the power equation of the countries of the region. But they do constitute what I think is a breach into the autocratic norm that has prevailed in the region since the closing days of colonialism. However, this small change is believed to be reversible in many cases at a moment's notice, because it has not been accompanied yet by the democratic paraphernalia that we are familiar with in Western liberal democracies. Now let's talk about the pessimism that has been rampant about the Middle East and North Africa, and which, I sometimes share. I am naturally an optimist, but at times I do fall into the trap of pessimism. So let's look at pessimism. In recent years, many people have written on the absence of democracy in the Middle East, on MENA region, and about the third democratic wave that has bypassed the region entirely. In this age of increasing pace of globalization and of capitalism as we see it, it's really the victory of liberalism and liberal democracy. The Middle East and North Africa appear to be unaffected and unmoved by this trend. In spite of powerful external forces and persistent domestic challenges, most states of the region seem to heed very little to calls for meaningful change, even if such change is in their best interest, the interest of the regimes in place. The pessimist view continues that in the last 10 to 20 years, many developing countries, third world, have adopted more or less stringent economic reforms that were either self-designed or imposed by international institutions. A few of them have enacted some political reforms that amounted to either a simple political liberalization or full-fledged democratization. Some of them have even gone through economic and political liberalization without much trouble, while others have experienced serious instability and ended up reversing course by going back to the comforts of the autocratic rule. During all this period, the Middle East and North Africa appear to have been unaffected by this trendy change, and the autocratic rule continued to live on without any serious challenge at home or from abroad. There is a dominant impression that the region is either cut off or protected from the forces of democracy and the market that have prompted change in most other parts of the world, especially since the end of the Cold War. In this presentation, I would like to look at the extent to which these observations are verified by the recent evolution of the region, and also what economic and political conditions in MENA have given rise to these observations. Also, what kind of changes, if any, have been taking place in the MENA region, and to what extent these changes are in fact making the MENA countries slowly fold under the pressure of change. I will argue that, contrary to the general impression, many meaningful changes have been taking place in the region, which may not really be as immune to the democratic trend as it may seem. They have also been slow, sometimes inconsequential, and also without the necessary institutional support. But changes have been taking place. Taken all together, they constitute an important mutation that is slowly taking place in a constraining environment and without much support from the outside. In the medium term, they may consolidate into a definite crack in the walls of the autocratic fortress that the region has been known to be. In the meantime, many of the elements that gave rise to pessimism are still prevalent and will be summarized here. There is the question of what we mean by democracy, political liberalization, democratization, and so on. And I think for any serious study of this, one needs to distinguish them so that we could be able to see change happening. Political liberalization is the first step, where you open up the political space, allow some freedoms, reduce slightly the arbitrary rule of the state. Slight. Democratization is when you create a host of institutions that will lead towards the democratic state itself. And the democratic state itself is something that is, I don't think it is something that we can define very simply. It is a very complicated matter. And many countries that, or if not all countries that we know are democratic, are still struggling to make the meaning of democracy be a lived experience in everyday life, even in the United States. And the political liberalization, just to be short of that, could be understood as the process that allows political freedoms and establishes some safeguards against the arbitrary action of the state. Democratization, which follows in normal circumstances, is a process through which the state control over society is slowly diminished to a point where the state becomes less arbitrary and more prone to bargaining with key groups representing differentiated social, economic, and cultural interests. In this process, the state progressively tends to resort less to command governance and more to negotiated public policies. Democratization can strengthen the state's legitimacy and give it a new basis as society acquires a greater autonomy. So the democratization process that follows liberalization is supposed to lead to the democratic state. And democratic state is a whole different thing. Democracy is understood by many as a set of institutions, a process, and a political culture, which allow individuals and groups to have a regular input in the process of public policy making. And then there were other elements in there. But it is important to note, for the case of the Middle East and North Africa, that Western traditions associate democracy with secularism, which represents a fundamental corollary of the democratic order. This association between democracy and secularism has been a major point of contention in the debate on democracy and Islam, on democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. The opening of the political system to citizen participation is almost always the result of a bitter struggle. And America is no exception, since it was experienced here, it was experienced in France, in Great Britain, everywhere where democracy has flourished. So it is a struggle between those who hold power and society at large that sometimes lasts a century, if not more. The form, length, and historical timing of this struggle varies from one country to another, and so does the nature of the democratic experience itself when it is finally reached. Therefore, and as we have learned from the demise of some theories on modernization, countries cannot be expected to go through similar experiences and follow preset stages or chronologies of political development. Even though scholars have built theoretical models and identified general patterns, it is necessary to adjust one's expectations for each particular experience that is being studied. The gloomy picture that we have of the Middle East in this context, a gloomy picture of an immutable Middle East and North Africa. Let me start with the socio-economic failures and achievements since they have become independent. The region is, first of all, a mosaic with different resource distribution and different levels of wealth across the entire region. It includes some of the poorest countries in the world, such as Yemen and Sudan, and some of the wealthiest, such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Some of them are gifted with important hydrocarbon wealth, while others have only few mineral resources. Within the last 40 years, most countries have achieved a substantial progress in comparison to what they had started with at the time of independence from the colonial rule. All have increased their overall wealth, which became relatively better distributed. They educated most of their citizens and achieved relative stability and continuity. Both urban and rural areas benefited from this progress. However, given their resources, and when compared with other countries with similar or lesser potential in other regions of the world, most MENA countries have lagged far behind what they could have achieved. They have fallen very short of the objectives that they have set for themselves decades ago. Most are food importers, have weak and undiversified export capacity, and have experienced a high rate of urbanization that puts pressure, of course, on the resources of the state. In the 1990s, the total urban population of the region reached 135 million people and kept increasing as development in the rural area kept also faltering and falling short of expectations. The total population reached today, 295 million. And some populations are doubling every 25 years because of the high rate. According to some estimates, 60 million people in the region live in poverty. After having decreased in the 1980s for countries like Egypt and Morocco, poverty has increased in the 1990s and continues to be today a major reflection of the failure of development strategies in the region. According to a current World Bank estimate, 1 out of every 5 people lives on less than $2 a day. In some areas, it's less than $1 a day, like Morocco, 30% less than $1 a day. And the bad conditions of health, education, and habitat make the poverty extent even worse for many. The causes of inadequate and slow development in the region are numerous, including flaws in the overall development strategies themselves, failed industrialization, and agricultural development programs. Also, the political management of the economy, which also has been a problem. On top of this, the inhibition of the birth and development of the private sector, since the public sector tended to control most of the economy. In addition, for some countries, the military expenditures diverted important resources away from productive and investment in infrastructure. The oil exporting countries were not spared from the problems faced by the countries that lack that resource. And only a few of them have thought seriously about how to survive in the after-oil era, such as Saudi Arabia. The almost exclusive reliance on oil rent for economic development led these countries that produce oil to a series of problems, which in turn hurt economic growth and made these countries economically and politically vulnerable. These problems included the lack of diversification of the production and export base, weak taxation, resolvent capacity, urban bias in economic policy, which worsened life in rural areas and encouraged rural migration. In most cases, there was a lack of consideration of alternative development strategies and a weak incentive for improving productivity and efficiency. Regardless of their resources and development strategies, most countries of the region ended up with some important similar difficulties, mainly a poor performance of the agricultural sector, which led to further impoverishment, food imports, rural migration, inefficient industries whose losses are often covered by state support, and weak domestic savings, which in combination with budgetary and balance of payment deficit led many countries to borrowing money in the international market. Heavy borrowing in the late 70s and much of the 80s added yet another concern, debt servicing, which consumes an important part of export earnings for some countries. There have been also problems in a host of other areas. Human development in general, the indices there are very low. Let's take illiteracy. About 65 million adult Arabs are illiterate today. 2/3 of them are women. And the illiteracy rate could be higher in some countries among them. Morocco has been said to have like 65% illiteracy rate, something that is unthinkable this time. This situation is compounded by employment difficulties, as every year thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of young graduates do not find jobs. And some of them even refuse to take jobs below their expectations or often prefer to wait for public employment. This is one of the private sector, and private sector manages to offer some jobs, even at a time when the public sector itself is expected to shrink. There is a development of a parallel economy, underground economy, which has managed to pull some of that labor that could not be employed. So we have a host of a huge number of people, especially young, working in the parallel economy or an informal sector, as we call it. In some places, up to 40% of economic activities are in the informal sector, which is not controlled, which is not taxed. The economic reforms, most countries have engaged in some economic reforms, some of them serious, some of them just thought about economic reforms, some of them very stringent economic reforms. So the results have been different in some cases and sometimes in some areas quite similar. Whenever structural adjustment was implemented, to stabilize declining economies and improve some aggregate indices, they managed to do that at the aggregate level, whereby countries managed to balance more or less their budget. They managed to accumulate greater hard currency reserve, which is a very important element, and also control inflation. However, they failed to turn things around for the population in general, and for a host of reasons, which some of them are linked, have to do with the programs themselves, and others have to do with the resistance to change, resistance to reform from people either in the state or outside of the state itself. The reforms in the end proved ineffective because they led to the contraction of the economy, the reduction of the demand, and expansion of unemployment. Furthermore, the austerity policies were often not accompanied by measures to resume growth at a healthy rate. A healthy rate is between 5 and 6, and the average has been 3%, sometimes -0, -1, -2% for some economies at different times. Tunisia stands as an exception in this scenario because of its small economy, its strong resolve to reform, and the existence of a small but vibrant private sector. So it managed to take full advantage of structural adjustment and alleviate some of its most negative social effects. It has succeeded. The other side of the coin is that at the political level, it has gone the other way around, totally in the other direction, which is the closing of the political field. We'll come back to that. Now, let's talk about the political conditions that we are witnessing. In most countries, entirely new and young generations are governed by old elite that are having more and more difficulty maintaining the internal status quo and containing the forces of change. In spite of the movement towards some political liberalization, the political systems remain largely unchanged. You should read the Arab Human Development Report 2002 that came out not long ago, and you will see very important statements made about the condition of the Arab world in terms of development, political and economic development. And that is the first time such a report was ever produced. The report suggests that the problems of the Arab world, leaving out, of course, Iran and Turkey and Israel, the Arab world are rooted in institutional structures in the form of three deficits. Deficit in freedom, deficit in the empowerment of women, and a deficit in knowledge. Not only acquisition of knowledge, but also the use of people who have acquired knowledge. The societies have not been able to do that. In the area of state-society relations, civil society as a dynamic phenomenon remains as elusive as democracy itself, and state power remains in the hands of powerful monarchies, civilian military coalitions, or conservative elites within the state bureaucracy outside. Power is largely exercised in an authoritarian way, and any radical challenge has usually been met with swift and harsh repression. In most countries, there are some characteristics that have been shared. They include the existence of a powerful and very active secret police, which is itself a major threat, of course, to free political action. Rigid censorship in many countries. Some of them have managed to really break free from that censorship, like Algeria, for example, to some extent, but most of them still suffer from that. There is a disregard for basic civil liberties and citizenship rights, even though we see signs leading us to believe that things are changing, but the general picture is that of still a strong disregard for them. Women also remain severely marginalized in both the economy and the political system, and they are still discriminated against by the local laws and by the customs. The parliament, they have been suspended for a long period of time, most of them, or just done away with, but we witness in recent years a reinstatement of them. But in general, most countries have lived with either suspended parliaments or with parliaments that did not really do much. Another element, rampant corruption, political corruption that we find across the region. Unlimited also tenure of leadership, especially in the Arab countries. And that is, of course, a problem for any serious change. There is also the control of the state, directly or indirectly, of the press. That also remains, as I've said earlier, something real in most countries, even though, and some of them have managed to change that. In the countries that hold relatively free elections, the outcome of elections does not seem to challenge the nature of the existing regime. The freedoms permitted in recent years remain fragile but reversible and at any moment in the name of a national emergency rule or other thing. Now, how can we explain the limited advance in the democratic order in the Middle East and North Africa? And many people have attempted to do that. There is the cultural explanation, which has been rejected a long time ago, that the Arabs or the Middle Easterners have such a culture that is totally against democratic values and democratic rule and so on. And that's something, this is an argument that does not stand at all, because the same problems Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries suffer from are found elsewhere. Similar patterns also of governance are found somewhere in non-democratic countries. The argument of the incompatibility of Islam with democracy has been used to dash all hopes of political change, but it is as weak as the cultural argument proved to be. There are other explanations that people have been attempting, including the authoritarian legacy of the Ottomans, that was authoritarian, especially in its last years, that rule, the authoritarians of the Ottomans has left a legacy in the Arab world. Another one saying that the impact of colonialism, that the colonial powers have ruled, of course, with an authoritarian manner, and therefore, after independence, the new state had no other aspiration on how to rule themselves but in an authoritarian way. This is also questionable, or some of you might find it interesting to probe. Another one, the Arab-Israeli conflict as a permanent excuse to postpone reforms and also to continue repressing the opposition, because it would weaken the country in the face of an enemy, Israel. Another possible explanation, the Islamist threat. This is the most rampant today. That is, there is this Islamist movement which is challenging the existing regime, challenging order, challenging the unity of the country, and so on. And therefore, this Islamist threat has prompted emergency law in many countries, such as Algeria and Egypt, and also is postponing the political opening that everybody is yearning for. But challenges have been really there to the existing regime, to the regime for the opening, for political opening. And the challenges have come in many ways and from many quarters. Domestic mutations, along with external pressures and constraints, have been challenging the authoritarian rule and the patterns of distribution of resources for more than a decade. So this is not something new. Let me get some water. At home, this challenge has come in many forms, including religious, ethnic mobilization, and outright rebellion against the economic failure, against corruption, and flagrant economic injustice. A series of contributing factors to the rise of this societal challenge include the increasing access to independent printing press. Now you could press independently from the state mechanism. Also, the availability of Xeroxing things and distributing them. The Internet, of course, a very powerful tool, even though not all Middle Easterners have access to the Internet, but still a wonderful tool for mobilization. Along with the loss of the government's monopoly over information, people have access to satellite channels. Incredible. Even in the poorest areas of the Middle East, you would find those satellite dishes, on the roofs. And from the outside, the challenge to the MENA states has come in the form of external economic shocks. These were very important, like the fall of the oil prices in 1986, a major element. Another one, the forces of globalization themselves, which have been diminishing the ability of states to manage their economies as they wish. And then the stringent requirements of structural adjustment, which also have imposed that have been challenging. Also, helpful external assistance to the challenge to the authoritarian rule has come through the establishment of links of international support networks for women, for example, journalists and human rights advocates. This has been a very important thing. Another element in the forces leading up to this challenge is this increasing gap between states and societies, and we see it even in this connection. As a result of the ineptitude of state authorities to deal with the crisis, the gap between states and societies has further increased, especially when society is demographically fairly young. About 40% of the population of most countries is under 15, and the leadership is aging. Even when younger leaders replace their fathers, like in Morocco, Jordan, Syria, regimes, however, have continued to maintain that gap so far. Another element leading or encouraging the challenge is a missing project for the future. This is very important. After having failed to fulfill the promises made many decades ago, many regimes find themselves today without a new or clear project for the future. They are characterized by exhaustion, ideological poverty, lack of reform resolve, and fear of sharing control with an educated and politically mobilized society. And this has opened up the possibility for the Islamists, which have a plan, a project for society, to come to the fore. Of course, in the process, the secular opposition was completely decimated almost in all countries. The challenge from society, even if civil society, defined in the strictest sense, I'm not going to go over it now, does not exist in most Middle Eastern and North African countries, associative life has flourished to a great extent across the region. Encouraged by technological development that facilitates communication and by successful democratization processes outside of the region, and frustrated by unresponsive and inept governing elites, independent associations and new political parties have been exerting a persisting pressure on the resilient authoritarian rule. These regimes have at times made some concessions, but they never wholeheartedly embrace political opening. And whenever it has happening and wherever it has happening, it is what has become what was called by some scholars the liberalisation à contre-cœur, which is you do it just in spite of yourself. The Islamist challenge, the secular opposition, weakened by state repression, internal division, and disconnected from those that it's supposed to represent, has been displaced in the last 15 to 20 years by Islamist movement and parties, which have become the main aggregators and articulators of popular grievances and desires. While radical Islamic challengers have been met with a harsh repression, the moderate ones have either been tolerated, such as in Egypt, Morocco, and Bahrain today, co-opted or included through a token representation in state institutions. At the same time, state authorities have sought to adopt much of the Islamist discourse in order to neutralize this potential opposition and improve some legitimacy. However, citizens at large, which have become more attentive to politics, this is really a new phenomenon within the last 15 years, have developed a cynical attitude towards these token gestures and manipulations and have grown not to expect much from the state itself or its governing elite, regardless of their ideological orientation. And we could feel this if you travel throughout the region and you talk to people. Opposition may be tolerated today in many countries than it used to be 15 or 20 years ago, but its direct impact on public policy making remains weak. Today, incumbent regimes justify the limits on political opening by the green menace, the Islamists, the radical ones, of course. Now, there have been changes. What are these changes? They have been slow and incremental. The signs of change. In the early 90s, faced with major social and economic difficulties and an increasingly challenging Islamist opposition and a popular demand for change, many Middle East and North African countries reluctantly engaged in stringent economic reforms and began slowly opening the doors of their political system. Richard Norton, big political scientist, writing on civil society especially, observed in 1993 that even though political repression is still widely used to deal with individuals or groups, the scope of the failure is so broad that few rulers today have pockets deep enough or jails large enough to cope with the problems in traditional ways, which is repression. Therefore, something has to give. The political reforms were necessitated by the need to obtain popular acquiescence to unpopular economic measures in some countries and the need to inhibit potentially destabilizing popular rebellion. In Algeria, Jordan, and Yemen, the government allowed political activity and mobilization that were prohibited before. Opposition parties, even communists and Islamists, were allowed to enter parliament and be represented in there. And whenever parliaments were revived in the region, they have tended to become more and more assertive. And there have been also the development of independent human rights organizations, which were allowed to monitor and denounce abuses and to link up with similar international organizations. The case of Morocco is an excellent case. Starting in 1994, the king was pushed to open up the doors and released hundreds of political prisoners. Also, regular pluralist elections are becoming more and more the norm across the region. Yemen, Algeria, Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, and Qatar, Bahrain, even though they do not take place in a fully democratic environment, but they appear to be fair and the result uncontested and respected so far. Look at the elections in Morocco. Islamists were allowed for the first time. They were allowed in the 1997 election to have 9 people in parliament for the first time, and they were not under an Islamist party, just 2 other parties. This election allowed now 42 Islamists to enter parliament, and women. The old parliament had 2 women. Now 10% of parliament members are women. 34 women entered parliament. And this is, I think, a major move ahead. And this is, I think, unique in the Arab world. This is just the election that just took place. In Iran, the largest non-Arab state in the Middle East, it has as a president a relatively moderate cleric, Mohammed Khatami, who did much better, in fact, in the elections of 97 than the candidate of the religious conservatives. Him and society at large have been resisting the totalitarian temptations of the religious elite and have managed to get important concessions from them, and the battle goes on. At the economic level, under economic and external pressures, many countries have engaged in some economic reforms, which include the liberalization of trade, the privatization or dismantling of some state-owned businesses, and the enactment of new investment laws that would entice, of course, foreign investment. If sustained and implemented, economic change of this nature will eventually stimulate more political change, as the power of the state diminishes as a result of demand from social and economic actors for more political liberalization. This may eventually lead to the tolerance of a genuine political pluralism and to some other ingredients of a democratic order, not the order itself. In recent years, the Jordanian, Algerians, and Moroccans and Lebanese have opted for a carefully managed political inclusion of the opposition in the political sphere. But the institutions in which they are represented, of course, still lack the power to make some of the most important decisions. However, pressures for change in the nature of the state-society relations, combined with other factors, such as the worsening of the economic crisis, may eventually and finally lead to a more substantive change. This change may not bring about democratic order, as we know it in the West, but it is likely to be a modest change in the what I call the modus operandi, the way they operate, the way things function in the MENA region. In other words, in the future, some public policies may result more from bargaining between the state and the social and economic forces than from an exclusive top-down process. The economic factor that may contribute to this trend, which are visible today, is the increasing limitation of state resources and their availability for public projects and services, for employment and subsidies. This trend will undermine the character of the state as a patron, because this was used as a tool also to govern. The constraining impact of globalization and trade openness is going also to lead in that direction. The pressure from creditors and international institutions to deregulate and privatize, not necessarily democratize. The increasing need to rely on the private sector for investment for the fulfillment of public works and services, which the state can no longer take. This may help improve the power position of people in these countries as the state becomes more and more dependent on its constituents. Rentier states, of course, may follow this scenario in the short run or may not. It depends on the price of oil. The increasing social and economic pressures resulting from the domestic mutations and international changes are going to also push forward in that direction. In order to avoid a further deepening of the crisis and potential social upheaval, these states will be pressured to enter into bargaining with new social and economic forces. And this bargaining has already started in some countries. Even if the bargaining leads to more painful measures, especially economic reforms such as austerity measures, the responsibility of the pain will be shared. This process may not be democracy itself, but starts out as a tactical inclusion in the context of a liberalizing polity, which may in turn turn into an actual widening of the political sphere if it is nurtured and supported accordingly at home and also from abroad. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? 10 more minutes. I'm about to conclude. This political evolution has to go, as I see it, of course, has to go in tandem with the opening of the economy. In the long run, the domestic private sector will necessarily play in it a role that is becoming greater and greater. The government's retreat from the management of the economy as we know it today will gradually diminish, and so will its ability to provide basic services and protection. This diminution of this ability is already present. In order to avoid the pitfalls of a simple or temporary survival strategy that some regimes might have already attempted, there needs to be public policies resulting from bargaining institutions and also the need for institutions that are accountable. Accountability really is a major problem. Open and free channels of communications from the public at large. This is developing more and more. I was very pleased that this is a long time ago. I don't know if they have done it while I was not visited in Morocco, having kind of town meetings with the Prime Minister. Wonderful thing, having a town meeting. But then sometimes people ask questions that are difficult to deal with on TV. And so therefore that was not continued on a regular basis. But things like these, show up from time to time and bring about hope. Also, working legal system. Legal system is a very important thing since people are not guaranteed liberty and freedom and protection if they speak up their minds. And if you don't have a reliable legal system, then that is going to be an obstacle for political openness. So just to conclude, change, I think, is underway in the Middle East and North Africa. But even though it is slow and sometimes unrecognizable patterns from the outside, because we're used to some patterns that we have in our minds. We look at the Middle East and we don't see them, then we don't see an evolution of change. But this change is happening, and it is making a change in the system that seemed to have been bypassed by the democratization wave. And these changes are present. One has to really not only read between the lines, but has to go in the field and to talk to people in order to see these changes. And these changes are institutional, are formal. They might be in the books, or they might be in the text of laws, but they may not be a practice. But what we could witness is that the state is more and more pushed now to bargain, to negotiate, to reorganize coalitions of support in society because of the various challenges it is facing. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
We do have time for maybe a couple of questions if the speaker would.
Yes, please. Yes.
Before September 11, there was clear signs that the entire project of the Islamists was disintegrating or at least receding. If we take it on the official level, for example, the project of the state in the Sudan was disintegrating. Iran was changing. Even the Taliban were changing a little bit. Now, if we look around, we will see that the Islamists are reinstating themselves again, and it seems that they didn't learn a lot from their past experience. What's your take on that?
Yeah. It depends, really, in some cases, from one country to the other. Let's remember that the Gulf War, 1991, really was a very stimulating factor in the development of the Islamist movement. The Gulf War was an incredible opportunity for them to challenge not just the policies of the West in the Gulf, but also the policies of their own governments. And that was a marking factor. And since then, things have changed. And I said that some Islamists have managed to get into parliament, institutions, even occupy ministerial posts in some countries and so on. And some of them, and many of them, like in the last election in Algeria, they have really been dismissed. They have lost a lot. At least those tolerated Islamists that have been allowed to form political parties. The others are still waging the war, but the war, the violence of the Islamists has diminished drastically. The prospect of war in the Gulf again against Iraq is going to be exploited to the fullest extent possible by the opposition in the Middle East and North Africa. And the Islamists are going to be in the front line of that opposition. And they will use that opportunity to mobilize even more. In Morocco, the biggest Islamist movement has not been legalized yet. That's Adlul Ihsan. And that movement will be up front, challenging not just the war against Iraq, but challenging its own political authorities. And so I would not be surprised to see an upsurge, another upsurge of the Islamist movement. This is in the mind of the rulers in the area. Just the last few days, a couple of weeks, the Egyptians have started cracking down on Islamist militants, have been jailing some of them. They have started this just to prepare for what might happen if a war starts. So that scenario is very likely, but some governments are preparing for it because they have learned from the Gulf War. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the transition from a secular opposition to an Islamist opposition over the last couple of decades.
Yeah.
Is there any political space for a secular opposition to reemerge in some of these countries in the foreseeable future, or is that path closed off by the prevalence of Islamist oppositions right now?
Very good question. I think that there is room for it, but it has to do a lot of work. It was decimated, it was divided, there were internal divisions in that secular opposition. There is room for it, but it has to really be able to have a message that would carry. And so far, it has not been able to develop that. It has been highly divided on the relation on how to deal with the state, how to oppose it, to be part of it or not to be part of it in the first instance, whether to coalesce with the Islamists or not to coalesce. Some of them have been really flirting with the Islamists as coalition partners, as an opposition, and some others have been staying away from them because the Islamists have themselves. Some of them have themselves antagonized the secular opposition, have killed many of them, especially in Algeria. So really, and the secular opposition, especially like in the case of Morocco, which has really been part of the political process, even though with not much significance for a long time, has disassociated themselves more and more from the social base, and that vacuum left was taken over by the Islamists. So and now that after the left managed to be appointed to lead the government under King Hassan in his last years and governed and have failed to live up to the expectations of people, that really is making their grave even deeper in that sense. So they have been incapable, inept, because of past things that happened to them. Of course, they were harshly repressed and so on, and it's taking them time to pull themselves together and to try to bring about a new message that will carry that, and also to be really truly representative. So there is a battle that is going on today between the surviving secular opposition and even new ones in new forms between them and the Islamists. But the message of the Islamists is just too powerful. The Islamists are fighting in several fronts, and one of them, the basic one, and this is a strategy followed by some groups explicitly, to Islamize society. Have people get closer to religion as close as possible, become more religious, and listen, of course, to the religious discourse and the religious plan for society. They think that way the regime will fall by itself one of these days. And this has given them, of course, a greater potential for improving their showing in elections and so on, while the secular has been sometimes all of them singing the same old songs. And some of them have been part of the establishment for a long time, that they have become the establishment, and so on. So I would love to say that there is the picture looks different, but I hope that the secular opposition manages to get its act together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.